Home, online, or in your office, settle back down again. They're so interested in the tea and biscuits here that they're, well, actually, it's Poland, so it's cakes, delicious cakes. Come on, come on. Because I'm going to start without you all. Right. Hello. So, I have this top-class, top-quality panel with me here. And what we're going to talk about, and can I just apologise on behalf of two patients? We had intended to have a patient here, but the last-minute illness of our original participant has meant that we're without a patient. So I'm going to be the patient and fight your corner on this one. But what we wanted to talk about was the future of patient participation, conventional, hybrid, fully decentralized. And you've met some of our panel earlier. We've Rachel Copland, Ditte from the Medicines Regulatory Authority, and I've said that in the wrong order, Medicines.
Yeah, it's from the Danish Medicines Agency.
The Danish Ministry, and Ly-Mee that you've met before. And I have now to introduce someone from the home team, Pavel Kochkodai, who is Deputy Director of System Analysis and Self-Study Department in the Medical Research Agency, with whom this meeting is being hosted. So thank you very much for your help and involvement, first of all. And Rachel, get out your crystal ball. What's the future?
That's a very big question. I think because we are moving more towards this participant-centered view of clinical trials, I would say that for this large question of is the future looking towards more conventional methodologies, more hybrid methodologies, or more decentralized methodologies, I would say it depends. It depends on a series of different circumstances, but I think ultimately the question is, in order to ascertain which methodology is most appropriate for our participants, we have to ask the participants. I think what's key here is giving participants choice, flexibility, and making them feel like key stakeholders in the research process.
So wearing my patient hat, it's about us, not about you.
Exactly. I think the new way of looking at things has to be that the participant is the absolute focus of the research. That's not to say that they haven't necessarily always been the absolute focus of the research, but going forwards, we need to include them as key stakeholders. Just as much as our sponsors are important, just as much as our vendors are important, we need that participant to feel like they are an active member of the research team.
Ly-Mee, how does that accord with your own experience? And get out and a quick rub of your crystal ball.
Yeah, I think definitely it should be more patient-centered. I mean, our trials, all of our trials would have a PPIE, the Patient and Public Involvement group, but again, not all trials can be done in DCT. Especially, there are some, say, intervention that has to be done at the GP practice level, then you would probably have to get the patient in, and that would be what it is. So, but I think that it does actually include the geographic area, especially, you know, in Oxford, you do the trials, you've got like 20% of people have a postgraduate degree, and that's probably not representative of the UK population. So,
is it only 20%?
Well, no, just that there was that particular study that was only 20%. But
most of the people you meet in Oxford are professors.
So I think that it does actually mean you can reach out more, and I think that's a good thing because it gives patients outside your comfort zone a chance also want to take part in the trial. And I think that's important. And we have to think about how we can actually make a trial that would be able to reach out to those people who we don't usually probably get them involved because the limitation of where the GP practice are based, etc.
Pavel, you're beginning, you're starting this from scratch, as somebody said earlier. What future are you aiming towards in Poland?
It's very hard to say something ground-shaking now after all of the presentations and the talks. However, I think that the DCT is the future. I know from my own experience, my family experience, that people who are taking part in clinical trials, they want to have access to DCTs as well. I think there is a lot to do when it comes to this solution, especially when it comes to education. I think that I know from my professional impression and from my personal background that we need education on clinical trials as itself, and additionally about the DCTs, and this is the key. How can we make this more, of course this is one component, how can we make this more, let's say, popular solution? There is a lot of areas, let's say, like underserved areas where DCT could be implemented effectively. However, on the other hand, there are some threats as well because of the internet connection, data security. This is the great concern now in Poland, I guess also in the EU, when we are talking about the like in general about the science, about the health science, medical science. This is the data protection. So some people would say that they are afraid about their health data if they are taking part in clinical trials, which is decentralized, which is in some way understandable, but once again, coming back to the beginning, I think we should educate, educate. Of course, this is like only small piece of the challenges and the future and the things what has to be done to have this more developed here in Poland.
Ditte Zerlang Anderson, I'm guessing that as a regulator, you have to prepare for all futures.
Yes, well, we're certainly trying, but I mean, listening into all the presentations today, engaging with all the participants, I feel very comfortable that we are heading towards this hybrid natural state, I would say, also mentioned by our panelists. So, and as suggested by our industry organization, FPA, I think it will become a toolbox that we will tailor to the study depending on those specific needs. And I think that with that, the regulatory setup will definitely also be easier to accommodate those trials.
Now, I'm asking questions, but I want all of you to ask questions too, because I want this to be a proper conversation between you, a highly knowledgeable audience, and our top quality panel. That's what you know, our TQP, top quality panel. So think of things that you'd like to ask, and if now don't giggle about being a top quality panel member, Pavel. Yes, I was just giving him one of my Margaret Thatcher handbag looks, because you are top quality. So, let's look at some more specific things. Obviously, some types of condition are going to be more suitable than others. And actually, to take up your point, Pavel, about education, patients who have existing, perhaps long-term conditions or chronic conditions are much more comfortable with the language of trials than perhaps people who maybe are newly diagnosed or don't have those same kind of life-threatening conditions. But what about you, Ly-Mee? What do you think about the kind of conditions that might be most suitable? Yeah.
I think chronic condition would be one that a lot of the participant, because they've been sort of like having the illness for a while, that would probably be suitable. But I think that it does actually depending on sort of like what condition as well. So some type of patient might not want to be keep reminding themselves as patients, and I think that's something that is important as well. I think that interestingly, we talked a lot more about patient, but actually there might be some sort of, say for example, screening program, the healthy volunteers would also be, the whole general population, that would also be probably an interesting group as well that you would be thinking of. But I think that it's difficult because I think I've done a lot of trials with people who have chronic condition but also acute condition. And I don't seem to see there's any difference of that sort of like the willingness of participation. And I think is all down to what Rachel was saying, is that clear communication. It's the most important thing. And when you want somebody to take part in the trial, you have to respect the patient's view and what they see and what they think, and how do you actually want them to take part, rather than thinking that, well, you have to come to my trials. So I think that's the bit that we'll probably have to do better. And I mean, I think trials, our communication is improving, as time goes as well.
Pavel, I mean, things like rare disease lend themselves particularly to DCT. Is that something that you think of? I'm thinking also particularly of the focus of the EU with their rare disease strategy and their cross-border initiatives, where you've only got a couple of people in each country, or you've got a tertiary referral centre and people scattered across the country where they're supposed to be coming back to a centre, but it's very costly for them to do that.
Yeah, I think so, and I would say that the rare diseases is one of the main areas, like the group of diseases where DCT could be implemented, like as well as we heard chronic diseases, like in general, but also I would say that we should think, like in general, maybe people who have some limitation with mobility. So here we can have people like elderly people and children. We had very nice presentation about the pediatric trials just before our panel. So I think that this would be these main groups, and I think that I would come back also to the underserved populations, because this is the chance for these people to take part in a clinical trials for sure. So yeah.
But with underserved populations, you also have to convince them that a clinical trial is not an experiment on them, because that's the language that's used in clinical trials, and it can be very, very off-putting. People think it's an experiment on them.
Yeah, like without any medical basis, like first time ever and things like that. So yeah, this is also about the education, as we mentioned.
Rachel, what are your thoughts on this?
I would agree. I think education is probably the best way that we can communicate to prospective participants about how they can become involved in trials, and how we can have this conversation that actually you're not a subject in our studies. We value you, we value your input, and we are trying to work together to find solutions for you to help you feel better about your given medical condition. Terminology is so important. We've seen that within trials at home. Within just decentralized trial methodology, there's a lack of consistency in terms. We're trying to, within trials at home, reach consensus. We have our own glossary, for example. But this goes to show that there's inconsistency, not only from the participant side and the patient side, but also within the trialist side. So it is this very complicated sort of subject, but I think that education and indeed PPI, so patient participant involvement, patient public involvement is the key to get this message across.
So I was very struck by something that Robert Joyce said earlier. You may have missed that in your wanderings across Europe. But he was saying that actually when it was a patient explaining the trial, then actually the pickup was much greater, because it was somebody like me, and that made a big difference.
Indeed, it is very easy for us as trialists to get caught up in the jargon, DCTs and BYOB, ECRS,
Is that bring your own bottle?
No,
It's what you have on invitations sometimes from cheapskates giving parties. BYOB, bring your own bottle.
BYOD.
BYOD, sorry.
Which is bring your own device. The jargon does not necessarily mean anything to participants. In some trials we've seen where they've involved patient groups who have helped develop recruitment materials, they've been able to create these materials that are at a sort of lay language that is understandable to a more general population. I think it's very easy for us to get caught up in thinking, especially when conducting clinical trials, we have, within our ethics, we have to get across certain points of information. But what does that actually mean to the participant? So yes, I think that goes back to the whole message of my talk, is that we have to be involving the public, we have to be involving patients, we have to involve participants in order to reach this consensus of what does this mean for them.
And I'm very much liking the word participant. Participant means active involvement, which is what it should be. What doesn't go down well, I find, is subject.
No, I think subject is quite a common term used in, it's quite a technical term. I would typically only use that to refer to clinical trials that were not in humans. We use participant in trials at home because not every participant of a trial wants to be called a patient. Patient can occasionally have a connotation of illness, lack of wellness. We don't want to make anybody feel excluded, so this is why we use participant. We want people to feel that they are important collaborators and important stakeholders, and above all else, valued in our studies.
Any thoughts from you entering this particular conversation? Oops, Christine. Hang on, Martina is bringing you the...
Just to report on some comments from the audience, and there is a very interesting mention saying the patient is the expert, so saying patient, but is the expert in their own condition. Talk with the patient and not to them. So I think this is really to mention.
Very important point, whoever made that.
Yeah, and I think just also to mention that we were supposed to have, of course, a patient representative in the panel, and so due to health condition, it is not possible. But just to remind to the audience, yeah.
But I'm rooting for you. Any patients online? I'm being the patient and just making your case for you. But I think that is the language is incredibly important. And just another point that this is kind of wearing my journalist hat, but I think that every document that you produce should be capable of being read by a participant without them feeling that you use one language for them and something totally different in your own sort of environment, because it makes, I mean, I think in the same way that doctors' letters used to be written in one way for doctors and another way for the patient, and now you're getting the same letter from, say, a consultant for both doctor, because otherwise it makes the patient feel that there's something different being said to the consultant that they're excluded from.
Yes, exactly. When we design our training materials, we want to design for the average reading level of that country. I believe in the UK, the average reading level is 12 years old, meaning that we want to create documents, create consent materials, recruitment materials, etc., that can be understood by someone with the reading level of a 12-year-old. This means that we cannot use complicated terminology that risks excluding the participant. I'm sure I sound a bit like a broken record just now talking about how important it is that the participant feels like an active collaborator in our trial, but we have to also make sure that we are not finding different ways to exclude them. And by using complex terminology that separates the level of respect between the participant and the medical professional, for example, you are risking excluding your participant further. That's not what we want to do in decentralized clinical trials.
We've got a question that came in earlier, and which is really for you, Ditte, is do you have examples of marketing authorizations provided or based on fully decentralized or even partially decentralized trials by the EMA in the EU or by the FDA in the US?
We don't have the statistics right now on decentralized trials in Europe, but I think I can say fairly sure that we don't have any drugs that's been authorized based on fully decentralized trials. I mean, our marketing authorization colleagues are only beginning to coming on to this journey with us. So the first place we always see the new innovative steps is in the clinical trial authorization phase. And to be honest, we haven't seen a lot and almost none of these fully decentralized trials in Europe yet. But we haven't done the whole mapping, and we are starting to do a little bit more tracking now. That's also part of our next phase. To learn also more on our own environment, not to track all decentralized elements, but to track the most important key factors, so that we will be able to tell you something more specific.
And do you have any sense of any particular countries or regions of the world even where they're moving ahead with this quicker than others?
I can't really say because we don't have the statistics, but there is a great willingness all over Europe. You saw 12 member states participated in our task force. I mean, all member states have endorsed the paper and the work and will follow it, but 12 member states is quite a lot to invest heavy resources in it. And so Denmark and Italy, and I think there are several countries that have their own recommendations on decentralized trials. I know France is doing a lot, as you say, from ECRIN on decentralized trials as well.
Do you have any knowledge of that?
Back to Rachel's point about the trial materials. One of the things that we talk a lot about how we can focus in more about digitalize the trials in a way that we can actually do the decentralization. But one of the group that we also need to consider, given that, say, for example, in the UK we've got very multi-international people in there, that there are people whose English is not their first language. And I think that this is something that it will take time to how we can actually speed up that process of translation, like translating all these informations and can also deliver the trials in a sort of like decentralized, in a DCT way. I think that a lot we talk a bit more about is how we can actually do it in our local area, but without thinking about the local area also includes a lot of people might not speak their first language in the local area, and I think that's something that we also need to look into a bit more as well.
It might be interesting for you to know that when the genomic studies are done in the UK, Polish is automatically added to the list of translated materials because we have such a big Polish population in London. Is this an issue that you have in Poland?
I think that this is also a very important issue which you mentioned, that the cultural and language barriers are very important, and maybe this issue is not so much discussed, and I think that it should be also, because in Poland as well we have some communities with different dialects and
you've got a big Ukrainian population at the moment.
We have a big population of Ukrainians. So in some areas we adjust materials and they were translated into Ukrainian, of course with the participation of native speakers and so on, because this is also important that it should be translated by the native speaker, not like artificial, machine translating and things like that. Because this is an issue sometimes as well. And I really like idea to involve patients in the preparation of all of the materials. I guess that every regular person who is not involved in any clinical trial should understand when she or he is reading it. It should be understandable. So, yeah, this is once again super important thing.
And it's not acceptable. I mean, I know in the UK we have many populations, particularly from Asians, South Asian, where it's the children translating for the parent, which is really very difficult.
I mean, I have to say that our top recruiting site in principle, a GP practice, is actually got a translator in the GP practice, and they have recruited quite, a lot of participants coming from a different diverse background. I mean, there needs to be something in place, but again, it's a kind of resources that you required, and it has to be considered when planning a trial.
Rachel, we're talking a lot about patient and public involvement and engagement here. How do people who are running trials, how do they go about making sure that the people that they recruit to help them from the public and patient groups are not sort of, I'm going to call them professional patients. That's not meant to be derogatory in any way, but it tends to be people that are perhaps with a considerable education sometimes, who volunteer for these things, or who may stay for very, very long time and become very familiar with the way things are done. And then perhaps that's not suitable for people who haven't got that level of previous education.
So a lot of the time with patient advocacy groups, these are patient experts. These are patients who have, for example, lived with their condition for perhaps a very long time, or have been quite actively involved in the clinical trial landscape as well. I think the voice that they bring is very important, but I also would suggest maybe if you want to have a more varied PPI involvement in your trials. One thing you could do is asking for feedback when you're developing recruitment materials. Ask your participants, do you understand? A lot of DCTs, we need to be flexible. If you can find out that you have developed materials that your patient population, your participant population is not clear about, intervene immediately, change it. Change it before you've gone to your protocol stage if you can, because you should be involving participants prior to setup and design. I think you should be involving them right from the beginning to make sure that you're always getting the language correct, that you're getting the voice of the participant as a main key stakeholder in your research.
Hector, I was just wondering how you go about that in something like AstraZeneca. How do you go about getting patient involvement right from the start?
So what we have done is we have a database. We have identified, we get a recommendation from each country, identification of the patient. So what we do is whenever we finalize or we have a draft CSP, the protocol or the draft ICF, we select few countries from a different region so that we get a representation from a different region and get their perspective. So we try to take a feedback at a very early level and try to improvise on our protocol or informed consent, or even in terms of what can be done to ease out. Like example, in a protocol we have mentioned that we want to have a weekly blood withdrawal. What is the patient perspective about it? So that is something we try to take a feedback in terms of their comfort, and we try to see if we can make that patient friendly approach there. So that's what we try to do.
Thank you. Another question.
Thank you. Two remarks I had. One referring to Rachel, previous discussion on the inclusive language. It is important to notice that many of the trials ahead are actually on prophylaxis, and we're looking into diet interventions, fitness interventions, and those are actually healthy young people. So calling them patients is totally inapplicable, and this is one thing. Another thing is we actually have Ukrainian patients in our study population, and this is something we had to adopt to on the way. So we had our files and consent translated already during the study ongoing. The situation that has led to the change is well known. Yeah.
Thank you. And also a tip here is if you're using Google Translate, always do the backwards and forwards Google Translate. And if it comes back with complete rubbish that you don't understand, there is something awry there.
Yes, I think that's exactly what happened on my journey here with my taxi driver. Our Google Translate was not really working very well in our favour. Within Trials at Home, we try to find native speakers to translate our materials. So we have an initiative ongoing at the moment to translate our glossary. Because, for example, we need to make sure that if I say decentralized clinical trial in English, what does that translate over to in another language, and will that then make sense? So that's one of the things that we are currently working on in Trials at Home. It is very important to recognize some of the challenges that may come about from, you know, having all of these conversations but focused around the English language. The key, I would say, is bringing in native speakers who are also familiar with this area so that we can work together to come up with terminology that is reflective of exactly what we mean, but also makes sense to both clinicians, trialists, and a more lay population as well.
And you really struggle when you get into languages where there's no word for the thing that you want to, say. I just want to talk about the quality of data and missing data, and we were hearing earlier about missing data and, you know, monitoring strategies, because I know during COVID that remote source data verification was allowed in some countries but not in other countries. So what do we do about missing data? How about from your point of view, Ditte?
Yeah, so I didn't mention it in my talk, but missing data is a key point also mentioned in our regulations from the marketing authorization perspective. But actually it ties in also with the safety monitoring during the study, because as was mentioned, if patients are not filling in the questionnaire, that was very comfortable. You had a procedure when to call them. I mean, that's very appropriate. And so missing data is important on many different levels. Then how do you go about avoiding that? Because you're having a lot of patient-reported outcomes. I guess that's where the danger is. So I think that what was implemented here was really efficient. I mean, you have to think prospectively which of the data points might be in danger of missing data, and that's where you put in with risk mitigation strategies and thinking. And then the question on monitoring, I think, is another dimension. Of course, you can also then tighten your monitoring strategy on those data points that might be in danger. And then bridging to the remote monitoring setting, I mean, that is one of our, you can say, it's one of the touchy points for the regulators. It is a matter of position, this one, I would say, with the GCP inspectors, and whether they are allowing remote access to medical records, actually. So it's tracked. That's our first step, was to track that in our national provision overview. So you find that mapped out in our appendix. And then the GCP inspectors have just published a Q&A on a much more detailed level, and that I will be able to explain on what's possible and what to look out for on remote ones.
Because Ly-Mee, you had this fantastic call center, effectively. I mean, and what was I'm really interested, because people kind of fell behind in their data collections. So your people phoned them. How were they received when they called? I mean, did the patient or the participant just say, "Oh, I was getting round to that," or what were the reasons that they gave, and did they welcome the call?
During COVID, when we have the lockdown, I think I have to say that, well, I assumed that the participant wanted to highlight is filling out questionnaires because there's nothing to do at home. So our was actually quite good. But so the way that what I did was we produce a report every single week at that time to monitor the data, to see how the data comes in as well. But before that, because I know myself how I feel in the data, the diary, so this is why we sat together with the IT and the trial management and the nurses together. And when we were talking about at what point, day 7, at what time point that should we actually call them? Should we call them when they have missed any 3 days of the diary? Should we miss? So we actually had a lot of combination of that scenario comes up. Then we thought that day 7 would be good. But then all this at the same time as well that we have to train the call people to give time that when they talk. I mean, this is the bit which is important, and this is the bit which I feel that I'm quite proud of our research nurses when they do consent, etc. They listen to the participant a lot. They just talk and they maybe just get drifted away and talk about their life experience, etc. And we just let them do that. And so this is exactly the same as well when it comes to when we do the diary, etc. So we would able to talk to them in a nice way. But I think
so it's establishing that relationship in the beginning.
I think so. I think getting a call like day 2 just to say hello, how are you? We're the panoramic team, or we're the principal team. Just want to see how things going with you, etc. And that helped a lot. And then we were doing a lot of combination of like prompting of the emails of the diaries coming up, but also we would just pick up call and just say hello, just this is us, so that they know who we are when we were calling them, and they know that this is a call that we're reminding, okay, I must go to and get it done. But not all of them when the lockdown eased and when we have younger participant is getting a bit trickier to trying to get hold of them.
Yeah, because you don't want people to feel naughty. They haven't done their data, do you? I mean, there's a fine line, and establishing that relationship is just hugely important. And I guess people are often willing, because you said that there was a bit, there was a gap, and then suddenly, once your people had called, they were absolutely fine.
Yeah. I mean, we have it in our protocol how many times we can call them.
Yes.
So there is a maximum number, and if they don't pick up the call, and that's fine as well. But again, we would just have to specify in advance in the analysis plan what we need to do, how do we deal with the data, etc. And so that wasn't too, there was a bit more discussion between the statisticians about how we define the data. But I think the core team, a big credit to them to manage to, give a big push every time when I see, it's below 80, you have to make, and it's remarkable seeing the number of the calls that we've made that actually have made the improvement in the diary data. I think let's not underestimate the keenness of the participant who take part in the trial. Sometimes we feel that, I think it's that conversation with them, and that when they feel that they kind of own the trial as well as part of it, then they do actually have the obligation and obliged to be sort of like trying to do as much as they can for the trial.
Is that something you found?
Yeah, so I mean, when you remove the face-to-face visit between a participant and someone in the research team, you might be losing some of that trust that you build with your participant, or that your participant builds with you. And similarly, you lose some of that rapport, and that can be difficult to recapture in a remote setting. So it's exactly like you were saying, is that contacting participants, for example, just through telephone or through email, just to introduce yourself. It doesn't even necessarily have to be, hi, I want to collect this outcome data from you, but just to say, hi, this is who we are, this is what we're doing, do you have any questions for me, for example? That can be a really important part of building that rapport with participants, because ultimately that will be a challenge if you remove face-to-face participation, is getting that same level of trust and that same relationship with your participants, but in a remote way.
I think especially at the beginning, this is important to introduce, the people to the trial, and to describe what is the procedure and so on, to make sure them that they are going in a good direction and that they know procedures and so on. So yeah, I really like this approach to call and to say hi and to how it's going and blah blah. Yeah, this is very nice.
And we also want the participant to be aware of what their journey is going to look like within the research. So having that initial call from the beginning is a really good way to make sure that our participants fully understand what our expectations of them will be, and similarly what we should expect from them.
And there's a changing relationship with the telephone, isn't there? Because it used to be, and perhaps this is still the case in Poland, that the home telephone number, the fixed line, is the more important one. But now, certainly in the UK, and I suspect in a lot of other countries, if the telephone line goes at home, it's usually somebody trying to cold call you or sell you double glazing or, you know, one of those kind of things. And there's been a big, big shift away from the home phone and to the mobile. And we've got to be careful with the mobile because it means that people could be anywhere when they're taking the call. And we need to be thoughtful about that and that we're not disturbing what they're doing.
Yeah, so there's multiple different outreach methods you can use, and I think it's important to remember that our participants are all individuals and they will all have very different preferences. So for example, some participants may not want to receive phone calls at all. They may prefer a more low-touch approach. For example, maybe they want email, or similarly, some participants might want to hear from the study team via a study app. And if you use a study app, you can contact participants through, for example, push notifications and other gamification strategies in order to keep them engaged. So really it's about, I think, asking participants, how would you like us to communicate with you, and how can we work to support you?
Should we be doing decentralized trials by design right from the beginning? In other words, we should think about trials and then try and design them from the beginning to be decentralized if we possibly can.
I think if you are designing for a decentralized trial initially, you're looking at, okay, I want a trial and I want to include direct participant shipment, I want to include e-consent, I want to include telemedicine. In that situation, you're coming up with these methodologies to use without actually first having asked the participant what is valuable to them. I think we should be using decentralized methodologies as a way to support participants, and we need to be finding, we don't want to be in a situation where we are trying to find participants for our DCTs, but rather we should be finding methods, DCT methods, that are for our participants.
So we've got an interesting question that was submitted earlier from our online audience. It seems there's still insufficient data to be able to identify all the risks associated with DCT, including profits, of course. Do you think more health research, similar to your project, I think that was you, me, are needed, in particular in the EU region, and are more educational efforts required that are supported by national regulators, universities and clinical sites to familiarise all resources involved, but also to promote DCT, and I think we've already touched on that.
I mean, I'm a methodologist, okay, so it's a bit like the reason, you know, the adaptive design. I mean, I have people, researchers come in and just say that I want to do adaptive design without thinking, oh, what is your study question, what's your research question in the first place, and whether adaptive design is actually appropriate. So I think that sometimes we have to also go back to the drawing board just to say that, you know, whether DCT is actually appropriate first, rather than thinking that, you know, we just go, okay, everything should be done in this way, or anything. But I think that,
so in other words, you've got to think about what's the real value that is being added by DCT.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the two trials that we're doing, at that time we didn't really, there was no, it's an interesting way because we didn't really have a lot of options but to go into that route. So it's slightly different in that situation where, you know, now we're coming out and there are some other studies that we're actually also being in discussion with, might be thinking about Do we, can we, they would, the first question, can we actually go with the way that how you do the recruitment? And then we would just have to say, well, let's sit down and, and look at your study design first.
I mean, when you think, do you think more health research is needed? Obviously, the entire audience would immediately say yes, because that's the... But there's a question here.
Well, thank you. I was just thinking, because it's something that I have always thought about, the relevance of including patients right from the very beginning, as has been said here, but in order to find out the relevance and the impact of the endpoints that we are measuring. Because there might be a difference between what they consider is important for their health or what they are trying to measure. And apart from that, also for me has been always very disappointing the patient withdrawal from the study, not beyond the causes that are related with safety issues, but I wonder if this kind of patient-centric research might lead to the more empowerment of patients into the participation in the clinical trial. The role that they play, that, which is very important, is fundamental. And so in some way to formation, education, and so so that they can understand the impact that withdrawal from a trial with not quite good reasons might have. So I just wonder if this may reduce patient withdrawal, these approaches, these decentralized clinical trials may have.
Yes, thank you for this comment. I think that this is one of the biggest advantages of the decentralized trials, that people can be involved directly and they perceive this trial as its own thing. So they participate in a different way, we can say. So from my point of view, the involvement of the patient in the centralized trials is one of the biggest advantages. So yeah.
And what we haven't talked about is the self-organization of patients in patient groups, because what we see is quite often that clinicians will struggle to find enough patients for a trial of people with a particular condition. And the patients go off to Facebook and they've got 500 people in by Tuesday tea time. So that's where patients are involved in that way, then it can also be hugely beneficial for trials.
Yeah, certainly from the research that I've seen, a lot of the literature that patients themselves have produced have talked about this change and how they want to be more empowered. They want to be seen, as I've said, as an equal contributor to the trial. They don't want to feel that they are having their hand held by their clinician. They don't want to feel as though they need help because they live with these conditions.
And they know they're experts.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So they want to feel empowered. And so we have to find these strategies to empower them. And if that means that a participant wants to have a more active role, then we have to listen to that.
And we should also mention, of course, James Lind again, because the James Lind Alliance does exactly that. It works with patients with particular conditions to work out what research they want done that would be of greatest benefit. And it's often not some kind of small change in some biomarker, but it's something that might affect, I don't know, sleep or pain or all those other things that can sometimes be much more important. So, James Lind continues on.
So just a comment from or question for the panel. Wonder if the panel has a view consideration to asking patients to design a trial for them instead of the trial being designed for them. So I think it's in line what you mentioned. And I have a second question that is a very specific one. Is a decentralized trial going to be applicable to medical device in the near future? So maybe more for the regulators.
Yeah,
but-
Ditte, that's one for you, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, I'm trying to picture it. So whether the question, so medical device, I think is very often tested in a decentralized manner in the nature. So I don't really know if I have much more thinking on that. I mean, I would say yes, definitely, but it's not really the same thing as testing a drug. Because there are some bigger risks associated when you are testing a drug as compared to the device, depending on the device, of course. But,
Pavel, you were going to add something.
Yeah, I think this is the future, and this is like a subject of the further research, of course, and analyze in Poland as well. So we are not saying no, but we have to check. This is like a developing area. So yeah, there's no black and white answer now.
Okay, I'm now going to give you my Vivian Parry magic wand. And I want each of you to take my wand, which comes with limitless money. James Lynn falls down in surprise. It comes with limitless money. What would you do to speed up or ease the adoption of DCT? What would be the one thing you would do if you could wave my magic wand? Ly-Mee.
We want to have a very sound, robust system that would be able to streamline the whole thing from start to finish, and with all the tick boxes of the regulatory requirement. So I want to have a very good sound system that would be able to do this work. Yeah, and that's unlimited funding.
Oh, unlimited funding. Okay, Ditte, what do you dream of?
Yeah,
Your regulated dreams.
My
Do
regulated
regulators have
dreams,
No, not mine.
I would scratch that national provision overview table, right? So it's all aligned. I think that's what we all want.
Pavel.
I would say that I would like to harmonize all of the law across the Europe, all of the regulations, to make this particular solution available in each country of the EU, like independently of the place.
And sadly, that doesn't really, even if you throw money at that doesn't.
Yes, yes. This is a hard question. This is hard task, and we have to push this forward. And I'm dreaming that this will be the future. That in each country of the EU, the regulations will be like not the same, but similar and comparable. So.
And actually, I wonder if there's already an opening for that, because the EU is already talking about, I mean, of course, health is completely devolved to different nations, but with rare disease, they're talking about pan-European commissioning.
I mean, we are moving ahead in Europe to align a lot with the whole clinical trial regulation coming into force. And I mean, we need a little bit of time to also come together as environment. And so we are already taking the first steps. But yeah, it takes, of course, a little bit of time. And then changing all the national legislations. I mean, that's the big hurdle, right? Hopefully it will come.
Okay, Rachel, you're up in Dundee.
So I think I would want to create a framework or some kind of guidelines, because I've mentioned earlier about how DCTs are going to involve stakeholders that we potentially have not worked with before. I know I love my hands up from the audience questions. If I could allow myself one more. Is anyone in the audience a programmer or a software developer or someone working in the development of technologies? So already we see there's one person. So already we see there is a gap there. If we're creating these trials that are relying very heavily on technology, where are the technologists in this room? Why are they missing from the conversation? I think, as we've seen, DCTs are not going to go anywhere, but there are going to be new stakeholders, and we need to find a way to bring them all together, because we are all speaking different language. If I said to someone, oh, do you know how to code that in C++? My doctors might not know what that means. I mean, honestly, I don't entirely know what that means. And so that goes to show just there is so much that we need to learn from others and that they need to learn from us. These new stakeholders, for example, we saw earlier, Royal Mail, that could be a stakeholder in DCTs. They don't know the logistics of clinical trial design. I don't know the logistics of Royal Mail. It's so important that we have this education and that we can all move together as one instead of moving in separate lines and hoping that everything will work out okay, because in practice that's not really what we see.
And logistics companies who are fantastically knowledgeable. I mean, if you ever sit next to somebody who does logistics, ask them how they get lemonade to supermarkets at Christmas. Because apparently that's the time of year, in the UK at least, when we drink just lorry loads full of lemonade, and how they get it around the country is just absolutely astonishing. But they have some of the answers. I'm being, frivolous, but actually those logistics people have some of the key answers that we need.
So when we did the principal trial, when we get the courier, we did actually have several meetings with them to tell them exactly how we want them to be done and how they can do it. So because it's a trial and we're delivering an IMP. So there was a lot of meetings, including the trial managers and the research nurses who know a bit more about the logistic of it, to talk to them. So it was a bit more in the discussions first, to let them understand why is it this is so important, to make sure that the delivery and how it has to be done that way. So we did actually have quite a few meetings before we actually get them on board.
Just to add, by involving these stakeholders, we are utilizing pre-existing infrastructure.
Exactly.
That way you don't have to learn how to become a world successful logistics company if you're operating from a team of 10 people. You can utilize these resources in order to find new ways to deliver this type of trial to our participants.
Well, thank you to our panel. I'm going to ask Jacques, I'm going to give him my Vivian Parry wand of wonder, and ask Jacques what one thing he would like to see happen.
One thing I would like to see happen, I think my concern, because ECRIN is about supporting multinational clinical trials in Europe, so I would love to have a more harmonized regulation and regulatory framework to conduct decentralized trial, because I understand that for the time being, and this is what you showed, for instance, in your slide, and the same in the very busy slide showed by Ditte, there are a lot of discrepancy between countries regarding the regulatory framework for clinical trials, and this is for us a major challenge. But what I would like to see that ECRIN could be able in the next 2 or 3 years to develop a network able to support decentralized clinical trials in any disease area.
Jacques Demotte, I grant you your wish.